Welcome, one and all, to the War on Ignorance, a declaration of conflict upon the brain-dead, the biased and the downright ignorant. I am here on the front lines, battling to inform the misinformed and shake the life into those who spend their lives sleeping. I will rip the Daily Mail from their cold, one-dimensional hands and offer up the only true alternative: fact. Today, in this inaugural operation of war, the intended target is Brexit. Alright, that's enough of that. That's enough of that nonsense. So, Brexit. It's been just over a year or so since the British public decided to leave the European Union. It was a decision that was a close-fought one and one that all but divided a nation. And now Article 50 has been triggered and the arduous divorce proceedings are going ahead. What is going to be the real impact of Brexit? I want to get at the facts of the situation. Not Tony Parsons' bigoted rants in The Sun or The Guardian's optimistic think pieces, but the real facts. No bullshit, no media bias, and not a hint of Nigel Farage's smug little ballsack of a face. I want to know what kind of a future that the hard evidence points towards in a post-Brexit Britain. And to tackle this ever-complex problem that has more layers than I could even possibly unravel, I've trimmed down my point of inquiry to 3 hot topics surrounding Brexit. Topics that were a point of contention leading up to the referendum, and that are still talking points now as we move into the negotiations. I'll be focusing on the UK's trading of goods and services with Europe, on immigration policies, and on national security. And I'll try to tease out what kind of effects Brexit is going to have on these 3 key areas. Now, the way that this video series is going to work, and the way that this war on ignorance is going to work, is that I will present you the facts as straight-faced and as unbiased as I can, with my opinion not souring the water at all. Once the facts have been presented in these 3 areas, I will then give you my opinion informed by this very information. So, without further ado, let's begin the war! The fuck am I doing? So in my search for what effect Brexit will have on EU trade and in turn the UK economy, I turned my attention to a study from the Centre for Economic Performance, which is a part of the London School of Economics and Political Science. The study was called The Consequences of Brexit for UK Trade and Living Standards. It's one of a series of studies from the CEP that look into the effects of Brexit, and I'll be referencing another one of their studies on immigration in the next section. Now, one point that the authors of this study make abundantly clear, and one that I think is quite important, is that we cannot truly know what the outcomes of Brexit will be, because ultimately that all depends on the exit negotiations and how they go. So to overcome this problem, the CEP took into account 2 very different scenarios on opposite ends of the spectrum. They looked at an optimistic scenario, a best case scenario for the UK, and a pessimistic scenario, the very worst case scenario for the UK. Now, the optimistic scenario assumes that the UK's relationship with the EU will be similar to Norway. Now, Norway is not a member of the European Union, but is considered a part of the European Economic Area, which in turn ensures a free trade agreement is in place. This agreement puts no trade tariffs on imports or exports going in or out of Norway. Norway also remains a part of the European single market, and as such adopts policies and regulations designed to reduce non-tariff barriers within the single market. However, Norway is not a part of the EU Customs Union, which causes it to face some non-tariff barriers such as rules of origin regulations, packaging standards and border controls that would otherwise be waived in countries that have a deeper integration with the EU. A similar relationship to this is considered a best case scenario by the CEP for non-EU countries. The pessimistic scenario assumes that the UK will be unsuccessful in negotiating a trade deal with the EU at all. In this worst case scenario, the UK will not be a part of the EU single market, nor considered a part of the EU economic area. That will leave any trade between the UK and the EU to be governed by the World Trade Organization. The WTO will enforce their own tariffs and non-tariff barriers upon trade between the UK and the EU, as they do with other non-EU countries. These tariffs are considered more costly as the European Union protects its members from such tariffs. As such, the study assumes that in this pessimistic scenario, that increased trade costs will emerge in 3 different stages. 1. Higher tariffs on imports. 2. Higher non-tariff barriers to trade arising from different regulations, border controls, etc. And 3. The UK may not participate in future steps that the EU takes towards deeper integration and the reduction of non-tariff barriers within the EU. Right, so how does all that complication affect the likes of me and you? Well, according to the CEP, the outcome on both the optimistic and the pessimistic scenarios is an overall negative one. Their estimation, even after removing the UK's contribution to the EU budget, is equivalent to a fall in income of between 1.3% and 2.6%, £850 to £1,700 per household per year. And that is only the short-term effect. The long-term effects predict a deeper fall, and once we include the long-run effects of Brexit on productivity, the decline in income increases to between 6.3% and 9.5%, about £4,200 to £6,400 per household per year. This result is not unique to this study either, with 6 out of 7 economic studies finding the very similar results on this very same subject. The only study who found an increase in income came from the Economists for Brexit, a study that was later debunked after glaring errors in its processes were pointed out by peers. In yet another of the CEP's detailed studies, the impact on immigration has been picked apart by a study called Brexit and the Impact of Immigration in the UK. This study sets out to determine whether or not the rise in immigration has had a negative or positive effect on the UK-born worker, and whether or not a reduced immigration would turn out a positive move for the UK economy. Now, this study is lengthy, so I'll just highlight some of the key points that came out of this study. EU immigrants are more educated, younger, more likely to be in work, and less likely to claim benefits than the UK-born. About 44% have some form of higher education, compared with only 23% of the UK-born. About a third of EU immigrants live in London, compared with only 11% of the UK-born. Evidence in this report shows that areas of the UK with large increases in EU immigration did not suffer greater falls in the jobs and pay of UK-born workers. The big falls in wages after 2008 are due to the global financial crisis and a weak economic recovery, not to immigration. Changes in wages and joblessness for less educated UK-born workers show little correlation with changes in EU immigration. EU immigrants pay more tax than they take out in welfare and the use of public services. They therefore help reduce the budget deficit. And it's worth noting here that even though this study finds no negative impact from immigration, it explicitly states that it cannot confidently say that there is a largely positive outcome. However, it does state that a reduced immigration brought in by Brexit is quite likely to lower UK living standards. Quote, "This is partly because immigrants help to reduce the deficit. They are more likely to work and pay tax, and less likely to use public services as they are younger and better educated than the UK-born. It is also partly due to the positive effects of EU immigrants on productivity." End quote. According to Article 4 of the Treaty of European Union, national security is the sole responsibility of member states. This means that national security, in all of the forms it takes, operates outside of European Union guidelines. As such, even a hard Brexit will have a minimal impact on national security, and in some instances may even provide a positive one. Now, all the information from here on in comes from a London School of Economics article written by Philip H.J. Davis and a House of Commons briefing paper by Joanna Dawson. Defence will remain wholly unaffected, only negatively impacted by reduced public funding if the economic situation in the UK is negatively affected, which predictions assume will happen. Other than that though, the greatest loss of defence comes at the cost of the EU and not Britain, as our defence forces will no longer have an obligation to support EU military operations. Intelligence agencies will also move on in the UK completely unchanged. This is because Britain is one of a collective of countries called the Five Eyes states, made up of the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and Britain. This group work together, collecting intelligence based on one another's requirements, and can provide a wider angled worldview than the entirety of the EU can. Where things get a tad sketchy is with domestic security. Although a tighter border control will make for better security and tighter constraints on the people entering the country, the UK's exit from the EU could end its shared cooperation with other member states. That could mean agencies such as Europol, which has proven invaluable in providing counter-terrorism information, would no longer be obligated to work with the UK on such matters. But apart from that issue, national security remains largely untouched by Brexit. In fact, the more likely reality is that Brexit could provide a positive outcome for national security. And that's it, that's the fact. I can stop biting my tongue now and get a little bit shouty about all of this. You ready? So I was pretty darn shocked with what I found, to be honest. I was under the impression I would find a much more nuanced dialogue occurring here, one where both sides of this Brexit debate would have a very solid argument. But it seems the overwhelming consensus of what I found in these studies is actually a damning indictment of what the Leave campaign pushed for. The economy, by all accounts, gets worse. Immigration harms that economy further, and national security remains largely unchanged either way. So it would seem, surprise surprise, that the Leave campaign outright lied to you. And these very studies prove that with empirical evidence. We were told that immigration threatened our jobs and livelihood, when that in fact was not the case. If anything, immigration stabilised the country, keeping us in just about neutral territories after the 2008 financial crash. We were also told that Brexit would be good for our economy, and our expulsion from the single market would do little harm. And even now the Tories are touting that slogan around no deal is better than a bad deal. All of this when 6 independently conducted studies contradict that very statement, with the only study finding a positive outcome called the Economists for Brexit. The Economists for Brexit. How much of a fucking spade do you need to be if you're going to trust those ostensibly biased wankers? They're called the Economists for Brexit, for fuck's sake. I mean, can you even imagine if the Economists for Brexit found something against Brexit? Can you imagine how bad of an image that would set for them? So of course that was going to happen. Yet another gleaming example of how aware you have to be in these kind of situations. Now let's bring the blood pressure down a little bit. The fact of the matter is that regardless of this damning evidence, Brexit is going ahead. We have little to no control over its outcome now. And that is abundantly clear given the results of the general election and now this fucking shambles that is the DUP-Tory coalition. We now have in power a government that we didn't actually vote for, making our vote almost pointless. So unfortunately, we're going to have to ride out on this rickety piece of shit roller coaster and hope that the mongoloids in charge of it know what buttons to press to stop this thing from fucking derailing. So even though what I've discovered can't really change anything at this point, what it does do is serve as a very important lesson. An important lesson for me anyway. It's a lesson that has proved to me that information is key. And sifting through that silt of political and media nonsense for those golden little nuggets of fact is enlightening, and above all else it is empowering. So please friends, remember to sift away at the very next time you even get the slightest whiff of bullshit, because the likelihood is that it is bullshit. Because right now, we've all been duped, we've all been lied to, and we're all but fucked. So what did you think of the inaugural war effort? A success on the battlefield? Come let me know in the comments down below or over on Twitter @DarylDoes. And please, if you think I got something wrong, come tell me, discuss it with me, engage with me. But above all else, keep waging war on ignorance. We're all but fucked, but fucked, but fucked, but fucked.